Welcome back. Turn the volume up, turn the lights down, and let the world outside get quiet. What follows was written down by someone who could not sleep until they told it. Subscribe to the channel, tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and press the like button below. Now, listen. 7 of us signed the register at the Primrose Trailhead on the 22nd of June, and the pen was tied to the box with fishing line so that nobody could walk off with it. I remember thinking that was a strange precaution for a place where the nearest lock was 30 miles behind us in Seward. I remember Andrew laughing about it and filming the little wooden box with his camera, narrating like he was making a nature program, saying that this was where civilization officially ended and the good part began. He was closer to right than any of us understood. We had come up from the harbor that morning, 7 people in 2 rented trucks, smelling of coffee and gun oil and the sour salt of Resurrection Bay. Mark Thompson had organized the trip the way he had organized 11 others before it, with a laminated schedule and a satellite messenger and a checklist that he read aloud twice, while everyone stood around pretending not to be bored. Mark was 65 years old and had been walking these mountains since he was 19, and he had the particular calm of a man who had already been scared badly once and had made peace with it. He carried an old rifle with a worn stock and a strip of orange tape on the sling. He knew the Kenai Mountains better than the maps did. Stephen Harris was 53 and had been Mark's brother-in-law for 22 of those years. He talked the entire drive. He talked about the price of the permits, the price of the trucks, the price of everything, and he talked loudest when he was nervous, which he was, because he had never hunted this far north before. Kimberly Sanchez was 46 and had spent 19 years working ambulances in Anchorage, and she packed her medical kit the way other people pack a firearm, which is to say she checked it 3 times and then checked it again. Stephanie White was 40 and worked survey contracts along the coastal ranges, and she was the only one of us who could look at a slope and tell you the grade of it without guessing. Andrew Clark was 32, the youngest, and he had 2 cameras, a drone, and an inexhaustible supply of enthusiasm that was already beginning to wear on Stephen. And Rebecca Ramirez was 62, and Rebecca was quiet. She had been Mark's friend since before any of the rest of us existed in his life. She was the one who noticed things. On the drive out from Seward, she had asked the outfitter a question that nobody else thought to ask, which was whether anybody else had permits for the Snow River drainage that week. The outfitter was a heavy man with a beard gone white at the corners of his mouth, and he had taken longer to answer than the question deserved. He said no. Then he said that most people preferred the Lost Lake side. Rebecca had asked why. He had shrugged in a way that used his whole body, the way people shrug when they are choosing between 2 answers and picking the smaller one. He said that the Snow River country was hard walking. He said the brush was thick. He said something about the drainage being closed to guiding in the 80s and never really coming back. Then he said, and I have replayed this more times than I can count, that if we heard anybody calling for help up there, we should not go looking. Stephen laughed. The outfitter did not. We started up the trail at 9 in the morning under a sky the color of wet aluminum, and by 2 in the afternoon we had left the maintained path and were following the creek line east into country that no longer pretended to have a trail in it. Alders closed over our heads. The ground under the moss was soft and untrustworthy and full of holes that could take an ankle. Devil's Club grew in green cathedrals along the water, and every one of us bled a little from the hands by the time we cleared it. It was beautiful. I want to be honest about that, because of everything that came after, and because the beauty was part of the trap. The Kenai Mountains in late June are green the way nothing in the lower 48 is green. Waterfalls came down the far walls of the valley in threads too thin to hear. Snow lay in the high couloirs in dirty crescents. Twice we stopped just to look, and Andrew flew the drone up above the alders and brought it back down and passed the screen around so everyone could see the shape of the valley we were walking into, a long bowl of green rising to gray rock, with the river a pale scar down the middle of it. Stephanie was the one who noticed the first wrong thing, and it was so small that she almost did not mention it. There were no birds. Not none exactly. There were ravens high up, 3 of them, circling in a way that never brought them lower than the ridgeline, but the small birds were absent. No thrushes in the alder. No sparrows working the creek gravel. She said it out loud around 4 in the afternoon, and everybody stopped and listened and heard the water and the wind and their own blood and nothing else at all. Mark said that country goes quiet when there is a bear moving through it. That is a true thing. It is one of the most reliable pieces of woodcraft there is. Kimberly took the bear spray off her pack strap and moved it to her hip, and Stephen made a joke about it, and we walked on. We made camp at 7 in the evening on a gravel bench above the river, 4 tents in a loose arc with the cook site 100 yards downwind the way you do it in Alaska. The sun did not set. That is the thing about that country in June that people who have not been there cannot properly imagine. The sun goes down behind the western ridge around 11, and the light does not go with it. What you get instead is 6 hours of a long amber dusk that never commits, a low gold gloom that lies across everything and turns the alders the color of old brass. You can read by it, you can walk by it, your body does not know what to do with it. I had not slept properly in that light on any trip. I did not expect to on that one. At around 1 in the morning, in that endless dim, Andrew woke me by scratching on my tent fabric with one finger. He whispered that I needed to come out and listen. I unzipped the door and crawled out into air cold enough to sting, and found him standing in his socks and long underwear, with a camera in one hand, facing east, up valley. His face in that amber light was doing something I had never seen it do. He was smiling, but it was the smile people make when they have not yet decided what they are feeling. He said that he had heard a woman calling. I said that there were no women out here besides ours, and they were all asleep, and I turned my head to say something else, and then I heard it too. It came from up valley, maybe half a mile, maybe more, hard to say with the water noise, a voice. A woman's voice, high and thin and stretched out, calling one long syllable that rose at the end. Calling the way you call when you are lost and have been calling for hours and your throat has gone raw with it. Then it stopped. Then it did it again, exactly the same. The same length, the same rise at the end, the same little break in the middle of the syllable. Exactly the same, not similar, the same. The way a recording is the same. Andrew lifted the camera and I put my hand on it and pushed it back down, and I did not know why I did that. I still do not entirely know why I did that. Something in the animal part of me had come awake before the rest of me, and it did not want that light pointed up valley. Behind us, quietly, someone said that we should get back in the tents. It was Rebecca. She was standing at the edge of the tent arc with a jacket over her shoulders and her arms folded, and she was not looking up valley. She was looking at the ground in front of her feet, deliberately, the way you look at the floor of a room you do not want to be in. Andrew asked her if we should not go see if somebody needed help. She said no. He asked why not. And Rebecca Ramirez, 62 years old, said that nothing in this valley was calling for help, and then she went into her tent and zipped it shut, and it was another 11 hours before she said a single word to any of us again. Nobody slept after that. By morning the group had split itself into 2 camps without anybody voting on it. Stephen and Andrew had decided it was a hiker, some solo backpacker who had come over the pass from Paradise Valley and gotten turned around in the brush, and the humane thing was to go up and find them. Mark and Kimberly thought it was a loon. There are loons on the lakes up there, and a loon at distance across moving water can put a sound into the air that stands every hair on your body upright. I did not believe it was a loon. I had heard loons. Loons do not repeat themselves with that kind of accuracy. Stephanie did not say what she thought. She spent breakfast with the map spread on her knees, running her thumb up the drainage, and when I sat down next to her she showed me something without commenting on it. On the survey sheet, the Snow River drainage above our camp had a section where the contour lines simply stopped being detailed. Everywhere else the lines were tight and fussy and full of little annotations. In that one section, maybe 3 miles long, they were smoothed out into vague loops, the way cartographers draw a place they have inferred rather than measured. She said that meant nobody had ever put boots on it. She said everything in that section was interpolated from aerial photographs. I asked her how common that was. She said in Alaska, more common than people think. Then she folded the map and said, more common than people think, but not that common. We broke camp at 9 and moved up valley, which in hindsight is the decision I have spent the most nights taking apart. We moved toward it, every one of us. There was a voice in the woods that repeated itself perfectly, and we picked up our packs and walked toward it. Because we were 7 adults with rifles and radios and a satellite messenger, and because that is what people like us do. We had come a long way. We had paid for the trucks and the permits. Going back down after one strange night would have been embarrassing, and it turns out that being embarrassed is a thing human beings will trade quite a lot to avoid. 2 miles up, we found the first of them. Andrew spotted it, which was fitting, because Andrew looked at everything. It was set back from the river maybe 40 yards, in a small clearing where the alders had failed to close, and at first I took it for a deadfall. It was not. It was a structure. 6 or 7 alder trunks, each of them green and living and as thick as my wrist, had been bent over from the roots and twisted together at the top into a rough cone about the height of a man. Not broken, bent. The wood had been forced past the point where wood bends and had held there, and where it had split along the fibers. The splits were white and fresh and weeping sap. Mark walked around it 3 times without touching it. Stephen said that bears do that. Mark said that bears do not do that. Inside the cone, on the moss, somebody had laid down bones, not arranged, exactly, laid down. There was a section of moose vertebrae, 3 of them still connected by dried tissue. There was a ptarmigan skull. There was the long curved rib of something large, and it had been scraped clean, and the scrape marks on it ran in parallel lines, 4 of them, evenly spaced, the way a hand rakes. And there was a boot. It was an old one, leather, mostly rotted, the sole separated from the upper and curled like a dry leaf. It had been there years. Kimberly crouched down to look at it and did not pick it up, and when she stood again, her face had lost something. Rebecca had stopped 40 yards back on the trail. She would not come into the clearing. When Mark called to her, she just shook her head, once, and turned her back to it and waited. We did not talk much for the next hour of walking. Andrew had stopped narrating. Stephen had stopped complaining, which was worse. At around 2 in the afternoon, we came out of the brush onto a long open bench of tundra and low willow, with a view up the valley to the head of the drainage where 2 glaciers hung in the shadow of the peaks, and standing on that bench, maybe 300 yards out, was a moose. A bull, a good one, in velvet, the antlers still soft and heavy on him. We all went flat and quiet by reflex, and Mark got his glasses up, and Stephen got his glasses up, and Andrew started his camera, and for about 11 seconds it was the best moment of the trip. 7 people on their bellies in the willow looking at a bull moose in a green Alaskan valley with the glaciers behind him. Then Mark said, in a completely flat voice, that we needed to back off the bench. I got my own glasses up before I obeyed him. I wish I had obeyed him. The moose was standing wrong. That is the only way I have ever been able to say it. It was standing on a moose's legs in a moose's hide with a moose's antlers on its head, and the proportions of it were wrong in a way that my eyes kept trying to correct. The shoulders were too high and too narrow. The neck came out of them at an angle no neck should manage. And the back legs were bent forward at the hock in the way a moose bends, but the whole hind section sat too low, as though something was crouching inside the animal and holding the hide up over itself. And then it turned its head, and it turned its head too far. A moose can look back along its own flank. This turned its head until the antlers were level with its own spine, and then it kept going, smoothly, without any of the little adjustments a real neck makes, until it was looking behind itself over the opposite shoulder. It was looking at us. At 300 yards, in willow, downwind, it was looking directly at us. Stephen made a sound. Not a word. A small sound, high in the throat. Mark said, again, that we were backing off the bench, and this time we did. We went down off that bench on our bellies and then on our knees and then at a fast crouching walk that turned into something not far from a run. And nobody looked back until we were 300 yards into the alders, and when I finally did look back, the bench was empty. Nothing had crossed the open ground. Stephanie was watching too, and she said the same thing. There were 900 yards of open tundra in every direction from where that thing had been standing, and it had not crossed any of it. It had simply stopped being on the bench. That night we made camp in a tight cluster with all 4 tents touching, and Mark took the satellite messenger out and sent the code for a non-emergency pickup request, and we watched the little screen until it said the message had gone out. At 11:15 in the evening, in that gold gloom, something walked a slow circle around our camp at a distance of about 80 yards. We could hear the willow moving. We could not see it. It went around us twice, unhurried, taking maybe 4 minutes for each circuit, and the sound of the brush moving was the sound of something large and patient, pushing through it without any care at all whether we heard. And on the second circuit, it started calling our names. It had Mark's voice. It had it perfectly, down to the gravel in it, down to the way he pushed his vowels forward. It called Stephen's name from the brush on the north side of camp, and Stephen, who was sitting 6 feet from Mark and looking directly at him, made that same small high sound in his throat. Rebecca said, very quietly, that nobody was to answer, nobody was to say anything, nobody was to say the word for what it was, Not out loud, not even quietly, because saying the word is a kind of address, and to address a thing is to invite it to reply. Andrew asked what word. Rebecca did not answer him. The thing outside called 4 more names in Mark's voice, and then it stopped. And then there was a long silence, and then, from the same place, it laughed. Not like a man laughs. It made the shape of laughter, the rhythm of it, the rise and fall, using a throat that had no idea what laughter was for. We broke camp at 4 a.m. in full light and started down valley, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted the trailhead that morning. We made 2 miles in an hour and a half, which in that brush is close to sprinting. Nobody talked. Kimberly walked with the bear spray in her fist. Mark had the rifle off his shoulder and carried across his chest, and never once put it back. Andrew had put both cameras away, which frightened me more than the noises had, because it meant that some part of Andrew had accepted what the rest of him was still arguing about. At around 6 a.m, we came to the creek crossing we had forded on the way up. It was gone. I do not mean the water was higher. The water was higher, but glacial melt does that every afternoon and drops again every night. I mean the crossing was gone. On the way up we had crossed on a gravel bar below a fallen spruce, and the spruce was still there, and the gravel bar was not. There was a channel where the gravel bar had been, 4 feet deep, running fast and gray with rock flour. Stephanie looked at it for a long time. Then she said that could happen. A jam upstream lets go. The channel moves. It happens. She said it in the flat voice of somebody reciting something true that they no longer believe. We went upstream to find another crossing. That is how we lost the day. We went upstream 3/4 of a mile and found nothing. And then we went upstream another mile and found a log jam we could cross on. And by the time we were over it, we were higher in the valley than we had been the night before, and the light had gone from morning gold to the flat white of overcast. That was the pattern of the next 2 days, and I want to be clear that I understand exactly how this sounds. I know that a valley cannot rearrange itself. I know that a creek does not close a door behind you. I know that 6 adults with a topographic map and a survey technician among them do not simply fail to walk downhill. I know all of that. I was there anyway. Every route down ended in something, a slide of wet scree that had not been there before, a wall of blowdown a 1/4 mile wide, spruce trunks stacked crosswise like something had raked them into a pile, a bog that Stephanie's map put nowhere near where we found it. Once, the river itself, running the wrong direction, which is not possible, and which 3 of us saw, and about which we never spoke again. And each night, in the amber gloom, it came and walked its circles and used our voices. It learned. That was the thing that broke Stephen. It got better every night. On the 2nd night, it had only Mark. On the 3rd night, it had Kimberly and Stephanie too, and it had begun to use them in combination, calling from the brush in Kimberly's voice for Mark and then answering itself in Mark's voice from a different direction. On the 4th night, it called in my voice, and I heard myself out there in the willow saying that I had found the trail and everybody should come. And the sound of my own voice coming out of that thing did something to me that I do not have adequate words for. It never used Rebecca's. In 4 nights, it never once used Rebecca's voice, and I do not know why, and she would not tell me. Andrew stopped sleeping entirely on the 3rd night. He sat up in the vestibule of his tent with his back against the pole and his knees pulled up. And when Kimberly tried to get him to take something for it, he told her, in a very reasonable tone, that he could not sleep because it was standing at the tree line watching him, and that if he stopped watching back, it would come closer. Kimberly asked him how he knew it was watching. Andrew said because it waved. On the 4th evening, we made camp in the only defensible spot we had found, a shelf of rock above a bend in the river with steep ground on 3 sides. Mark set the tents in a square. Kimberly and Stephanie built a fire that was much larger than a cook fire needed to be, and we fed it green alder that smoked in a thick gray column. And Rebecca walked the perimeter of the shelf and laid down a line of something from a small bag she had carried the entire trip and never opened. Ash, I think, and something else. She would not explain, and nobody asked her to. The thing came at 11:40. It did not circle that night. It came straight in. We heard it coming from a long way off, and it was not trying to be quiet, and that was somehow the worst part, because the 4 nights of patience had been a kind of courtesy, and the courtesy was over. It came up the slope through the alder, and the sound of it was the sound of a bull moose in a rut, huge and crashing and fast, and then when it reached the edge of the firelight, the sound changed. It went up on 2 legs. You can hear the difference. Anybody who has spent time in the woods can hear the difference between 4 points of contact and 2. The rhythm of it changes, and what came out of the alder at the edge of that firelight came out on 2 legs, and it was tall, and it was wearing a hide. I saw perhaps 2 full seconds of it, and I have spent 9 years failing to reconstruct those 2 seconds into anything my mind will accept. It was the moose hide from the bench, or one like it, and it was over the shoulders and the head, and the antlers were still on it, and beneath the hide the arms were too long and had too many joints in them, and the way it held itself was the way a man holds himself when he is imitating an animal, or an animal when it is imitating a man, and it was one of those, and I could not tell which, and that is what I could not survive looking at. Mark shot it. He put 3 rounds into the center of it at 15 yards with a rifle that would flatten a brown bear, and the first shot moved it, and the second and third did not, and it made a sound like a woman being surprised, and it went sideways out of the light faster than anything that size has any right to move. And when we turned around, Andrew was gone. His tent was there, his boots were there, both of them, side by side, laced. His camera was on his sleeping bag with the screen still glowing. There was no blood. There were no marks in the gravel, except ours. We called for him for 2 hours. Kimberly wanted to search the slope, and Mark would not let her, and she screamed at him for a long time about it, and he stood there and took it, and did not move. At about 2 in the morning, from somewhere down the slope, in the amber light, Andrew's voice called back. He called that he was all right. He called that he had fallen and was down by the water, and could somebody come. The voice was perfect. It had the little rasp he had developed from 4 days of shouting into the brush. It had his exact way of saying, "You guys," and then it said it again, exactly the same words in the same order with the same breaks, and then again. And it kept saying it, every 90 seconds or so, for the rest of that night, from a little closer each time. Kimberly put her hands over her ears, and Rebecca sat down next to her and held onto her wrists, and would not let her take them away, and would not let her answer, and would not let her go. We left everything at first light except water, food, and weapons. Stephen had come apart by then, in a quiet and complete way. He walked when he was pushed and stopped when he was not, and he had begun apologizing under his breath, continuously, to nobody in particular. Mark walked in front. Kimberly walked with Stephen. Rebecca walked with me. Stephanie navigated, and her navigating had taken on a desperate quality, because she had stopped trusting the map on the second day, and had been running on compass and dead reckoning since, and she knew, the way a professional knows, that her numbers had stopped agreeing with the ground. We found the cabin at about noon on the 5th day. It should not have been there. There was no cabin on the survey sheet, and no cabin in Mark's 40 years of memory of that country, and it was not a Forest Service structure, and it was not a trapper's line shack. It sat on a low rise where 2 creeks met, and it was built of squared spruce logs gone silver with age, and the roof was still on it, and the door was still on its hinges. Kimberly wanted to go in. Mark wanted to go in. Rebecca said, out loud, for only the 4th or 5th time in 5 days, that we should not go in. We went in. There were 6 of us, and it was going to rain, and we had left the tents behind. The inside of that cabin is the part I do not describe when people ask me about this, and I am only writing it now because I have decided to write all of it. The walls were covered in writing. Every interior surface, from the floor to the roof poles, in charcoal and in something browner than charcoal, and it was all the same short line repeated, in a hand that got worse the higher up the wall it went. Thousands of repetitions of the same short line. I am not going to reproduce it. Rebecca read 3 lines of it, and turned and walked straight back out the door into the rain. There was a bunk with a mattress of old spruce boughs gone to dust. There was a stove with the pipe fallen in. There was a table, and on the table there were 14 photographs, weighted down with a rock, and they were not old. They were of us, taken from perhaps 60 yards, in the brush, at every camp we had made. All 7 of us in the first ones. 6 of us in the last one, which had been taken the previous night, from the slope below the rock shelf. Andrew's camera had been on his sleeping bag when we found his tent empty. I had not touched it. Somebody had. Stephen began to laugh in the doorway, and did not stop for a long time. We stayed in the cabin that night because the rain came in hard, and the alternative was a wet slope with no shelter, and because a part of every one of us wanted walls, wanted a door, wanted the illusion of the built world. Mark put his back against the door and sat there with the rifle across his knees. Kimberly and Stephanie took the corners. Rebecca sat in the middle of the floor and did not sleep, and did not close her eyes and moved her lips silently for 6 hours. At around 3 in the morning, something knocked. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, polite. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And then Andrew's voice, on the other side of the door, at the level of Mark's ear, 6 inches of spruce away, said that it was very cold out there and asked if we would let him in. It said, "Please." Kimberly stood up. "I want to be careful here because Kimberly Sanchez was not a foolish woman, and I will not have her remembered as one. She was a woman who had spent 19 years running toward the sounds other people run away from, and that is not a habit you can take off like a coat. And she had spent 30 hours believing that a 32-year-old man she liked was lying hurt in the brush a few hundred yards away while she did nothing. She stood up and she said his name. She said it out loud. She addressed it. The door came in. It did not open. The hinges tore out of the frame, and the whole slab of it came inward and took Mark forward with it, and he went down under it, and the rifle went off into the roof, and the room filled with noise and cold, and the smell that came in with thing, which was the smell of a dead animal, opened up in warm weather. I saw the arm come in. That is all I saw, in the strobe of the muzzle flash and the fire. The arm, and the length of it, and the fingers of it, and how many joints there were between the shoulder and the hand. It took Kimberly out through the doorway in less than a second. She did not scream. There was not time for her to scream. There was a sound of impact and the sound of the brush closing, and then nothing. And Mark was on his back under the door yelling, and Stephanie was pulling him out, and Stephen was in the corner with his hands over his face, and Rebecca was standing in the middle of that ruined cabin in the rain coming through the open frame, with her arms out at her sides, saying something in a low, steady voice, over and over, facing the doorway. Whatever she said, it did not come back in. We went out through the open door at first light, with Mark limping on a knee that would need surgery and Stephen half carried between us, and behind the cabin, 60 yards up the slope, hung in the crotch of a spruce at the height of a man's head, we found what it had left of Kimberly's pack. The bear spray was still clipped to it. The safety was still on. Stephanie got us out. I want that on the record because of everything that came after and everything I have had to think since. Stephanie White, 40 years old, threw away the map on the morning of the 6th day and said that she was going to walk downhill and west and keep water on her left, and that anybody who wanted to live should follow her. And she did that for 9 hours, through brush that tore the sleeves off both her arms, without stopping, without once looking back to see if we were still there. We lost Stephen at around 4 that afternoon. He was walking behind me. There was no noise. There was no struggle. I turned around at the edge of a willow flat to check on him, and there was nobody behind me, and the willow was still, and there was no sound in the whole valley except the river. Mark wanted to go back. Mark Thompson, 65, on a destroyed knee, turned around and started back up that valley, and Rebecca got in front of him and put both hands flat on his chest and said the only long sentence I ever heard her say on that trip. She said that if he went back into that brush, he would not be the thing that came out of it, and then she would have to watch it wear his face for the rest of her life. He stood there for a while, then he turned around and came with us. At around 8 in the evening on the 6th day, we came out of the alders onto the Primrose Trail, actual trail, cut and graded and packed by boots, and I sat down in the middle of it and could not stand up again for several minutes. Stephanie walked us down the last 2 miles in the amber light. We reached the trailhead at 11:15. The register box was there with the pen tied to it with fishing line. Somebody had signed us out. All 7 names, in one hand, in a column, with the date and the time. The time was 2 days in the future. Mark tore the page out and put it in his jacket, and I do not know what he did with it. He would not talk about it afterward, and Mark and I did not really talk again after that summer, which I think was necessary for him, and which I have never held against him. Here is what the record says. The record says that 3 members of a party of 7 were reported missing in the Snow River drainage in late June, and that ground and air search continued for 11 days, and that no trace was located, and that the terrain in that drainage is exceptionally difficult, and that the party was under-equipped for the conditions, which is not true, and that the survivors' accounts were inconsistent, which is true, and which I understand. Andrew Clark, 32. Kimberly Sanchez, 46. Stephen Harris, 53. Rebecca Ramirez went home to New Mexico and did not answer any of my letters for 6 years, and then answered one, with a single page. And what she wrote on that page was that I should stop trying to find the word for it, because there is not a word for it in the language I am writing in, and the word that does exist should not be said by people who do not understand what saying it does. She wrote that she had been taught that when she was a child, and that she had spent 5 days in that valley being the only person in it who had been taught anything useful. She wrote that we did all of it wrong from the first night, that we answered it, that we looked at it, that we walked toward it. And she wrote one more thing, at the bottom, in different ink, as though she had put the letter down and picked it up again some time later. She wrote that I should stay away from Stephanie. Here is the part I have never put in front of anybody until now. On the 5th night, in that cabin with the writing on the walls, before the knock came, Stephanie went out to relieve herself and was gone 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I counted, because we all counted, because that is what you do by then. And when she came back in, she came in and sat down in the corner and said nothing, and something about her had changed its rhythm. That is the only way I can put it. The way she breathed had a different meter to it. The way she blinked. And for the remaining 30 hours of that trip, Stephanie White did not eat, did not drink, did not sleep, and walked 9 hours through Alder without once stopping, without once looking back. She saved my life. I do not deny that, and I am not ungrateful. But I have sat across a table from her twice in 9 years, and both times, in the middle of the conversation, in a warm room with people all around us, she has repeated something I said to her earlier in the conversation. Not paraphrased it, repeated it. The same words in the same order with the same breaks and the same little rise at the end. Exactly the same. There is a photograph pinned above my kitchen sink, and in 4 years I have not been able to take it down. It shows 5 people standing on a gravel lot in Seward, Alaska, with Resurrection Bay behind them, and the fog sliding off the mountains like something being poured out of a bucket. Stephanie White is holding her camera against her hip. Stephen Harris has one arm hooked over the cooler he refused to let anybody else carry. Kimberly Sanchez is laughing at something outside the frame. Andrew Clark is squinting into the wind. Rebecca Ramirez is not looking at the lens at all. She is looking past me, up toward the tree line, and her mouth is slightly open. I took that photograph. I remember taking it. I remember counting them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and thinking that the light was going and we needed to be moving. What I have never been able to explain is the 6th shape standing at the edge of the spruce, maybe 40 yards behind Rebecca, pale and narrow and just slightly too tall, with its head tilted sideways like a bird listening to the ground. It was supposed to be a simple trip, 2 weeks in July. Stephen had been planning it since February, sending all of us maps with routes drawn on them in 3 colors of ink, because Stephen was the kind of man who believed that a problem prepared for in advance stopped being a problem. He was 53 years old and had spent 30 of those years in logistics for a shipping company, and he treated our vacation like freight. Permits, tide charts, bear canisters, a satellite communicator with a fresh battery, a laminated card in every pack, with the coordinates of the trailhead written on it. Stephanie was coming for the pictures. She was 40 and had spent the last decade photographing weddings in the lower states, and had reached the point where she said if she had to shoot one more reception she was going to walk into the ocean. She wanted glaciers. She wanted ice and green water and no human beings in the frame. Kimberly was a trauma nurse out of Portland, 46, and she was the only one of us who had ever put a person back together with her hands. She packed her own kit and made us all show her our boots the week before we flew out, which felt like an insult at the time and which I have since thought about more than almost anything else. Andrew was 32 and had never done anything like this. He was Stephen's nephew by marriage, a soft-spoken guy who worked in warehouse inventory and who had asked to come along in a voice that sounded like he expected to be told no. Stephen said yes immediately. Stephen liked bringing people along. And then there was Rebecca Ramirez, who was 62, and who had hunted the Kenai Peninsula since before most of us were born. Rebecca was the reason the trip existed at all. She had grown up outside Moose Pass, 30 miles up the highway, and she knew the drainages the way other people know the rooms of their own house. She had put down 4 moose and more black bear than she would say out loud. Her hands were the color and texture of tack leather. She smoked exactly 2 cigarettes a day, one at sunrise and one at sunset, and she did not explain the rule to anyone. We had all met her through Stephen, at a range in Washington, and she had spent 2 hours correcting my grip without once making me feel stupid about it. When Stephen proposed the trip, she said she would take us up past Lost Lake and over into the Snow River country, and hunt a little, and fish a little, and be gone from the world for 2 weeks. She said one other thing at that first meeting that I did not think about until much later. She said she had not been up that particular drainage since 1991. When Stephen asked her why, she took a long time answering, and then she said the fishing had gotten better on the other side. That was a lie. I want that on the record. Rebecca Ramirez lied to us in a bar in Washington in February, and she did it to protect us, and it killed her. We landed in Anchorage on a Tuesday and drove the Seward Highway south with the windows down. If you have never made that drive, I do not have the language for it. The road runs along Turn-Again Arm with the water on one side and rock walls going up on the other, and the mountains are close enough that they feel less like scenery and more like company. Andrew kept leaning across Kimberly to look up through the window. He said it looked fake. He said it looked like a screensaver. Rebecca did not say much on the drive. She sat in the front passenger seat with her boots up on the dash and watched the tree line, and every so often she would say the name of a creek as we crossed it. Ingram, Canyon, Trail River. We got into Seward around 4 in the afternoon and the fog was already down on the water. There is a smell to that town that I can still bring up whenever I want to, which is unfortunately most nights. Diesel and salt and fish and cold rain on hot pavement, boats knocking against their moorings, gulls making that broken laughing sound they make. We ate at a place near the small boat harbor, and Stephen spread his maps out over the table and went through the plan a 4th time, 2 days up to the Lost Lake area. Then east, off the maintained trail, into a valley Rebecca described only by pointing at a wrinkle of contour lines. 9 days in there. Then out and down along Snow River to a spur road where Stephen had arranged a pickup. While he was talking, an old man came over from the bar and stood at the end of our table. He was maybe 70, with a face like a dropped map, wearing a jacket that had been repaired more times than it had been washed. He did not introduce himself. He looked at the map upside down for a while, and then he put one finger on the wrinkle of contour lines, exactly where Rebecca had pointed, and he asked if that was where we were going. Stephen, who was polite to a fault, said that it was. The old man asked who was guiding. Rebecca said her own name, just that, without looking up. Something happened in the old man's face then. It was not surprise. It was closer to the expression people get when a diagnosis they have been dreading finally arrives and at least the waiting is over. He said her family name back to her, and he said the name of the road her mother had lived on, and Rebecca finally raised her head. They looked at each other for a long moment. Nobody at that table said anything. Stephanie had her camera up out of reflex, and I watched her decide not to take the picture. Then the old man said the only advice he was going to give us, and he said it to the table, and not to Rebecca. He said that if something out there called us by our names from the tree line, we were not to answer, and we were not to go look, and we were not to say a single word out loud until the sun came up. Andrew laughed. It was a nervous laugh, and it died about 2 feet from his mouth. The old man did not react to it at all. He just picked his hand up off the map and told us to enjoy the country, and went back to the bar and did not look at us again for the rest of the meal. We walked back to the vehicle in the gloom and the fog, and Stephen made a joke about local color and how every trailhead town has one guy whose job is to say something ominous. Kimberly laughed. Stephanie laughed. Rebecca did not laugh. She walked ahead of all of us with her shoulders set, and she smoked her second cigarette of the day, standing at the edge of the parking lot facing the mountains, and when I came up beside her, I asked if she knew that man. She said that she had known his brother. I asked what had happened to his brother. Rebecca took a long pull on the cigarette and let it out slow, and watched it get eaten by the fog. And she said that in 1991, 4 people had walked into that valley, and 3 had walked out, and that the one who did not come out had been calling for help in a voice they all recognized for 2 entire nights, from about 100 yards outside their camp, and that they had not gone to him. I asked her why not. She dropped the cigarette and put her boot on it, and said that they had counted heads, and everybody had been inside the tents. Then she went to bed. That is the photograph. That is the evening it was taken. I have looked at that pale shape in the spruce with a magnifying glass and with a scanner and with software, and I can tell you that it is not a person, and it is not a stump, and it is not a trick of the fog, and that in the version of the photograph I took 4 years ago on a gravel lot in Seward, Alaska, it was not there. The first 2 days were the best days of my life, and I need to say that plainly, because everything after it is going to sound like I hated that country. I did not. I loved it. I still do. We came up out of the trees on the second morning and the whole Kenai opened up underneath us. ridge after ridge going blue and then gray and then white, and Lost Lake sitting in the bowl of it like something poured out of a jar. There was still snow in the shadowed folds in July. The wildflowers were so thick in places that you could not put your boot down without crushing a dozen of them. Stephanie went ahead of the rest of us and lay flat on her stomach on a rock shelf for an hour, shooting the lake, and when she came back down her face was wet, and she pretended it was the wind. Rebecca had a dog with her, a 9-year-old mutt named Juno, mostly husky and mostly gray, who had come up from Moose Pass with her and who ranged out ahead of us all day, and came back panting every 20 minutes to make sure we still existed. Andrew and that dog fell in love with each other inside of 6 hours. He shared his lunch with her, which Rebecca told him not to do, and he did it anyway, which Rebecca allowed. On the second night, we camped above the lake, and Stephen made a fire, and we drank the whiskey Kimberly had carried up. Andrew asked Rebecca to tell us something about the country, and she talked for a while about the '96 avalanche cycle, and about a man she knew who had gone through the ice on Kenai Lake and come out the other side. Nobody mentioned the old man in the harbor. It felt like something that had happened in a different climate. On the third day, we left the maintained trail. I want to describe what that is like, because people who have not done it think that off-trail means a slightly rougher trail. It does not. It means the ground stops helping you. It means alder, which grows in mats and which fights you like it has opinions. It means devil's club, which is a plant with a stem covered in glass needles that will put your hand out of commission for a week. It means that in 9 hours you will make 4 miles and you will feel every one of them in your hips. By evening we came down into the valley Rebecca had pointed at on the map. It was beautiful. I have to be honest about that too. It was a hanging valley with a creek running the length of it, braided and gray with glacier flower, and stands of black spruce along the benches, and the walls going up steep on both sides to bare rock. There was no trail. There was no fire ring. There was no cut stump anywhere I looked. And I looked, because I had gotten into the habit of looking. Stephen said it was the most untouched piece of ground he had ever stood on. Rebecca said nothing at all. She walked the perimeter of the campsite twice before she let anyone drop a pack, and she picked a spot with the creek on one side and a rock face at our backs, and I noticed that she did not choose the flattest ground. She chose the ground with the fewest approaches. That first night in the valley, nothing happened. I want to be precise. Nothing that any of us could point to happened, but Juno would not settle. She lay with her head on her paws facing the spruce on the east bench, and she did not sleep, and every so often her ears would go flat against her skull, and she would produce a sound that was not a growl. It was a much smaller sound than a growl. It was the sound a dog makes when it wants very badly to not be noticed. Rebecca sat up with her the entire night. In the morning her eyes were red and she said she had slept fine. The second night in the valley, we heard the first one. It was around 1 in the morning, which in July that far north is not properly night at all. It is a long blue dusk that never quite completes itself. You can see the shape of the mountains all night. You can see a person moving at 200 yards. That is important, and I will come back to it. The sound came from the east bench, up in the spruce, and it was a woman calling a name. It was calling Andrew. I was awake. I had been lying there listening to the creek. The voice came down through the trees, unhurried, a little tired, the way you call somebody in from a yard at the end of a long day, and it said his name twice. And it was Rebecca's voice, absolutely and unmistakably. The low scratch in it from 40 years of 2 cigarettes a day. The way she put the weight on the front of the word. I heard Andrew unzip his sleeping bag, and then I heard Rebecca, who was lying 8 feet from me, inside the camp, on the other side of a nylon wall, say very quietly, in that exact same voice, "Do not." I have gone over this moment more times than is good for a person. What I remember is lying completely still and understanding 2 facts at the same time. The first was that the thing on the bench was using her voice. The second was that it had gotten her voice from somewhere, and it had gotten it recently, and the only place it could have gotten it was from standing close enough to us to listen. Nobody spoke for the rest of the night. Not one of us. The voice called Andrew's name 11 more times over the next 2 hours, and it moved as it called, from the spruce down toward the creek, and then along the water, and then back up the bench, and at one point it was close enough that I could hear it breathing between the words. The breathing was wrong. It was too slow. A person calling out into a valley at 1 in the morning breathes fast, because calling takes air, because worry takes air. This thing took a breath every 15 seconds or so, deep and unhurried, like something at rest. Around 3 it stopped. At 5, when the light came up properly, Rebecca got out of her tent and walked to the creek and squatted there for a long time looking at the far bank. We all came out and stood behind her. There were tracks in the gray silt on the other side of the water. They came out of the alder, crossed 20 feet of open bar, and went back into the alder. For the first 8 or 9 feet, they were the tracks of a large animal walking on 4 legs, not a bear. The pad was wrong and the stride was wrong and there were no claw marks. Something long-limbed, something that put its weight down light. And then, in the middle of that open bar, in full view, the 2 front tracks stopped and did not resume, and the 2 rear tracks changed their spacing and their depth and their angle, and continued to the alder as the tracks of something walking upright. The stride length of that upright walk was a little over 6 feet. Kimberly, who had spent 20 years reading bodies for a living and who did not scare easily and who I loved for her flat, unromantic mind, crouched down and put her own hand into one of the prints, and then took it out and wiped it on her pants over and over. Stephen said it was a moose. He said it 3 times. Andrew was not looking at the tracks. He was standing at the edge of the water with his arms wrapped around himself, and he said, in a small voice, that when it was calling him last night, part of him had wanted to answer. He said it had not felt like fear. It had felt like being called home. Rebecca stood up. She looked at the alder on the far bank for a long moment. Then she said we were leaving. Right now. Packs on, nothing cooked, out the way we came in, and we would eat when we were up on the ridge. Stephen started to argue. He had 9 days budgeted. He had a pickup arranged. He had a laminated card. And Rebecca turned on him and said something I have never forgotten. She said that in 1991, they had also decided to finish the trip. We broke camp in 19 minutes. We could not get out. I need to explain what I mean by that, because I know how it sounds, and I have spent 4 years trying to find a version of this that does not sound like an excuse. We had a map. We had 2 compasses. Stephen had a GPS unit and a satellite communicator, and both of them worked, and I want to be very clear that both of them worked the entire time. The GPS gave us coordinates. The coordinates were correct. Stephen checked them against the map, and the map was correct. The problem was not that we got lost. The problem was that we walked the correct bearing for 6 hours, up the correct side of the valley. And at the end of 6 hours, we came out onto a bench above the creek, and Stephanie stopped and said that she had photographed that exact rock formation that morning. She showed us. Same rock, same angle of light adjusted for the hour, same little rotten spruce leaning off the edge of it. Stephen checked the GPS, and the GPS said we had traveled 11.4 kilometers. We were 900 meters from where we had started. The second time it happened, Kimberly sat down in the moss and put her head between her knees and breathed the way she must have taught 100 patients to breathe. Rebecca did not seem surprised. That is the part that has stayed with me. She did not seem surprised, and she did not waste a second on disbelief. And she started giving orders like a woman who had already had this conversation with herself decades ago and had only been waiting for it to come around again. She said we would not try again until morning. She said we would camp on high open ground with our backs to rock. She said nobody goes anywhere alone, not for water, not to relieve themselves, not for anything, and that if a person went out of sight of the camp, they went in a pair, and they went with a light, and they came back inside of 10 minutes. And she said the rule that mattered. She said that from that moment forward, when we approached the camp, we would say a word before we entered it, a word she chose right there, standing in the moss. She looked around at us and she said the word would be marathon, after the mountain above Seward, and that anything that walked into that camp without saying it was not to be allowed in. Andrew asked what would happen if something said it. Rebecca did not answer him. We made the new camp on a shoulder of open tundra, maybe 400 feet above the valley floor, in the last of the light. And that was the night Juno went out. She had been getting worse all day. She would not range. She walked between Rebecca's boots so close that she tripped her twice. She would not eat. Sometime after midnight, in that blue not-quite night, she came up out of a dead sleep, and she went rigid, and she looked out past the edge of the camp, and she made that small sound again. And then, very slowly, she started walking toward the edge. Rebecca called her. Juno did not stop. I have seen dogs disobey. This was not that. Her body was not going willingly. Her tail was clamped hard against her hindquarters, and she was crouched almost flat, and she was shaking so violently that I could see it from 15 feet away. And she kept walking, out past the last tent, out onto the open ground, one foot after the other, like something was pulling her by the collar. Rebecca went after her. I went after Rebecca, and Andrew went after me, because that was the rule. We got maybe 60 yards from camp before we found the dog standing in the middle of open tundra with her nose pointed down a shallow draw, and Rebecca got a hand into her collar and hauled her back, and Juno did not resist. She just kept staring down that draw. Down at the bottom of it, at the limit of what I could make out in that blue half-light, something was standing. It was tall. That is the honest sum of what I can tell you. Taller than Stephen, and Stephen was 6'2", and thinner than any living thing has a right to be while still standing. It was not moving. It had a shape at the top that I could not resolve, wider than a head should be, with points coming off it. And while I was looking at it, it took a step backwards without turning around, and it did that step in complete silence over ground that was ankle-deep in dry crowberry, and then it was not there anymore. Andrew made a sound behind me. We got back to camp. Rebecca said the word at the edge and made us say it too, and we went in, and Juno spent the rest of that night pressed against the inside wall of Rebecca's tent with her whole body shaking. In the morning she was gone. There was a hole in the side of the tent. From the inside, she had torn her way out through nylon, which a dog does not do unless the thing in front of her is worse than everything else available. Rebecca went out at first light and found her collar, and only her collar, on the tundra 100 yards downhill. The collar was not broken. It was not chewed through or torn. It had been unbuckled and set down flat on a rock, with the buckle facing up. That is the moment I stopped looking for an explanation. We tried to walk out again that morning. It took 9 hours, and we ended the day 2 ridges further into the country than we had started, and the ridges did not agree with the map, and by then nobody was saying that out loud. On the 4th day, we found the place with the antlers. We came over a rise on a north-facing slope, into the thickest black spruce we had been in, where the moss was so deep that you sank to your calf with every step, and the whole forest was silent in the way that only a place with no birds is silent. And there was a structure. I do not have a better word. It was not a shelter, and it was not a cairn, and it was not a hunting blind, and it was not any kind of trail marker that any of us had ever seen. It was maybe 9 feet high and roughly conical, and it was made of antlers. Moose antlers, mostly, dozens of them. Some so old they had gone chalk white and were coming apart in layers, some with fur and hide still on the pedicle. They had been interlocked, deliberately, tine into tine, into a lattice that held itself up, and woven through the lattice, threaded through it, were long bones, leg bones, ribs. Some of them were moose, some of them were caribou, which do not live in that valley. Some of them were not. Kimberly identified them. She did it very calmly, standing 3 feet away with her hands at her sides, and she said the words femur and clavicle and mandible, and she said one of them was juvenile, and then she turned around and walked 20 feet away and was sick into the moss. There were pieces of gear in it too, woven into the antlers like ornaments, a canteen from a war a long time ago, a boot with the sole rotted off, a length of rope, a camera strap, cracked and gray, with a metal fitting still on the end of it, and near the bottom, at about knee height, tied on with a strip of hide, was a small brass tag of the kind you screw onto a dog collar. Rebecca crouched down and turned it over with one finger, and read it, and did not say anything, and stood back up. It was not from Juno. Juno's collar was in Rebecca's pack. This tag was old. The brass had gone green. Stephanie raised her camera. Rebecca put her hand flat over the lens and pushed it down, gently, and said that we do not take anything from here, and we do not leave anything here, and we do not photograph it, and we walk away now and we do not look back at it. We walked away. Andrew looked back. I know he did, because I heard him stop. That night, for the first time, it came into the camp. At about 2 in the morning, Stephen Harris walked out of his tent and stood in the middle of our camp and said all of our names. I heard the zipper. I heard his boots. I heard him say, one at a time, in a completely ordinary voice, the names of every person in that camp, and then I heard him walk out past the fire ring and downhill into the spruce. I got my head out of my tent maybe 6 seconds later. Kimberly was already out. So was Stephanie. And Rebecca came out of her tent with her rifle already up at low ready, which is not a thing you do to a friend. And Stephen Harris unzipped his tent from the inside and came out squinting and asked what in the world was going on. I need you to sit with that for a second, the way we had to. He had been asleep. He had been asleep the entire time. Andrew had been in that tent with him and confirmed it. Stephen had not gotten up, had not spoken, had not gone anywhere. Something wearing his voice had stood in the middle of our camp, 10 feet from where I was lying, and had said my name out loud. Rebecca did not lower the rifle right away. She made him say the word first. He said Marathon, in a confused voice, and she lowered it. And then she sat down on a rock and put her face in her hands for about 4 seconds, which was the only time on that entire trip I saw her give any ground at all. Then she stood up and said that from now on, nobody sleeps alone, and there is a watch, 2 people at a time, and the 2 on watch face outward and never look at the same direction. Andrew asked, very quietly, how we would know. Rebecca asked him what he meant. He said, how will we know if it is one of us? Nobody answered him. Kimberly went and made coffee at 3 in the morning because there was nothing else to do with her hands. The next 4 days took everything. We tried to walk out twice more, and both times the country folded us back into itself. We started rationing hard. Stephen's satellite communicator sent its messages, and the messages went out and were received, and the reply came back that a helicopter had overflown our coordinates twice and seen nothing. I read those replies myself. I watched Stephen read them, over and over, this competent man who had planned everything, sitting in the moss holding a device that was working perfectly and was completely useless. It got into the routine of us. That is the thing nobody tells you about being hunted by something patient. It does not spend every hour at your throat. It taps on you. It takes a little at a time. It learned Kimberly's laugh and used it from the tree line one afternoon, and Kimberly heard her own laugh come out of the spruce and did not speak for the rest of the day. It moved our gear, not far, a pot 6 feet from where it had been left. A boot turned around so the toe faced the tent. It got the word wrong once, deliberately. I am sure of it. Stephanie and I came back from the water, and something in the spruce said Mount Marathon, the full name, in Rebecca's voice, and waited. And on the 7th night, Andrew Clark walked out. He was on watch with Stephanie. She turned around because she heard a sound behind her, and when she turned back, he was 50 yards downslope, walking, not fast, not staggering. And she called him, and he did not stop, and she ran after him and got a hand on his sleeve, and he turned around and looked at her. She told me afterward, when we were in the vehicle, going down the highway toward Seward, with the heater on full and both of us shaking. She said his face was completely relaxed. She said his eyes were wet and he was smiling a little. And he said, "Do you not hear her? She has been calling for hours." And he sounded so happy. Stephanie got him back. She got him back to camp, and Rebecca zipped him into a bag, and Kimberly sat with him and he slept for 11 hours. When he woke up, he was not right. He would not eat. He kept turning his head to listen to things none of us could hear. He asked Rebecca 3 separate times whether we were going to go get the dog. And on the 8th night, he asked me if I wanted to know a secret. And when I said yes, he leaned in close to my ear and made a sound. It was Juno's whine. Exactly. Down to the little upward break at the end of it. He made that sound with a human throat, 4 inches from my ear, and then he sat back and looked at me and waited to see what I would do. I did not sleep again on that mountain. On the 9th day, Andrew was gone, and so was Stephen's rifle. We spent 4 hours looking, which is 4 hours longer than Rebecca wanted to spend, and we found nothing. And while we were looking, Kimberly Sanchez got separated from us for a period of about 6 minutes on a slope covered in alder. 6 minutes. When we found her, she was sitting down in the brush with her back against a log, and she was fine. She said she had turned her ankle and sat down. She stood up and walked on it, and there was nothing wrong with the ankle at all. And she laughed at herself and said she must have panicked. And we all went back to camp together, and she made the evening meal. At the edge of camp, she said the word without being asked. Marathon. Clear as anything. That night I lay awake next to Stephanie in a 2-person tent with our boots on, because we all slept with our boots on by then, and I listened to Kimberly Sanchez breathing on the other side of the nylon, 3 feet away, in the tent she shared with Rebecca. I listened for a long time, and at some point in that long blue, not quite night, I understood what was bothering me. She was breathing too slowly, deep and unhurried, 1 breath every 15 seconds or so, like something at rest. I did not say anything until the morning, and I have to live with those hours. At first light, I got Rebecca alone at the creek, and I told her, and I watched 62 years of a hard life arrange itself behind her eyes. She asked me one question. She asked whether Kimberly had said the word at the edge of camp last night without being prompted. I said that she had. Rebecca closed her eyes. She told me then what she had never told any of us, standing in glacier water up to her ankles with her hands full of the cold. In 1991, it had been 4 of them. Her, the old man from the harbor, his brother Ray, and a 4th man whose name she would not say even then. And Ray had gotten separated on a slope for about 10 minutes, and Ray had come back, and Ray had been Ray in every way that a person can be checked, and they had traveled with him for a day and a half. And on the second night, Ray had started calling for help from 100 yards outside the camp, in Ray's voice, while Ray was lying inside the tent with them, 2 of him, at the same time. She said that they had made a choice that night, and that the 3 of them had walked out at first light and had not spoken to each other again for 31 years, and that the thing they had left in that valley had not followed them past the mouth of it. She said it does not leave the valley. She said whatever it is, whatever agreement it has with that ground, it stays inside it. Then she said we were going to walk down the creek, not out over the ridges, down. Follow the water, which does not lie and cannot be folded, all the way down the drainage to where it feeds into Snow River, and follow Snow River to the highway bridge. And if that took 3 days, then it took 3 days. But water goes downhill in this world, and it does not care what wants to keep us. I asked her about Kimberly. She said that Kimberly walks in front, where we can see her, and that nobody touches her, and nobody accuses her, and nobody lets her know that anybody knows anything. Because if Kimberly Sanchez was still in there somewhere, we were not going to be the ones who gave up on her. That was Rebecca Ramirez. That was who she was. We started down at 7 in the morning with 4 people, and I do not know how to tell you what that day was like. The thing in front of us wore Kimberly perfectly. It made her jokes. It complained about the same knee. It talked about her sister in Sacramento and got the details right. Twice it turned around and asked if I was doing all right, and both times my whole body went cold, and both times I said yes, and it kept trying to get us to leave the water. That was the only tell. Every hour or so it would find a reason. The bank is easier up there. There is a game trail on that bench. If we cut across this bend, we save an hour. Stephen, who did not know, agreed with it twice, and Rebecca overruled him twice, and by the afternoon Stephen had begun to understand something was happening and had gone very quiet and very gray in the face. We made 8 miles that day, which in that country, in that condition, is close to a miracle, and the creek got bigger under us and the walls of the valley started to widen out, and by evening I could see, far below and ahead, the pale braided flats where the drainage opened into the Snow River bottom. The mouth of the valley, Rebecca's line. We did not make it before the light went blue. We stopped on a gravel bar with water on 3 sides, and Rebecca said we would not sleep. We would sit back to back, and we would go again in 4 hours. And that is when the thing wearing Kimberly Sanchez stopped pretending. It happened without any drama at all. She was sitting across from me on the gravel, and she stopped in the middle of a sentence about her sister, and her face went completely slack. Not angry. Not monstrous. Empty. The way a room is empty. And she stood up, and her joints did something that I am not going to describe, and she walked backwards away from us into the water, upright, facing us, at a speed that no person moves backwards, and she went out into the middle of that gray glacial creek where it was running fast and thigh-deep, and she stood there. And then she started calling. She called with Kimberly's voice, and then with Andrew's voice, and then with Stephen's voice, while Stephen was sitting 18 inches from me with both hands over his mouth. She called with my voice. She called with a child's voice that none of us knew. She called with Juno's whine. And then she called with Rebecca's voice, and what Rebecca's voice said was not a name. It said, in that low scratch, that Ray had called for 2 nights, and nobody came. Rebecca Ramirez stood up off that gravel bar. I got a hand on her jacket. She took it off me the way you take a leaf off your sleeve. She told the 3 of us to walk down the water and not to stop and not to turn around, and she said it in the flat operational voice of a woman who had already finished her arithmetic. And then she waded out into that creek in the blue half-light with her rifle in her hands. We ran. I did not turn around. Stephanie did not turn around. Stephen, God help him, turned around once, and whatever he saw took something out of him that never came back, and he was in a facility in Oregon within 4 months, and he is still there. I heard 3 shots, then nothing. Then, some long time later, from far behind us and above us, I heard Rebecca Ramirez laughing. It was not a laugh she ever made while she was alive. We came out onto the Snow River flats a little after 4 in the morning, and we walked the gravel until the sun was up properly and the country stopped feeling like it had opinions, and around 10 we came out onto the spur road, and a man in a truck full of fishing gear took one look at the three of us and did not ask a single question the whole way into Seward. The search went on for 19 days. They flew that valley. They put 14 people on the ground in there with radios and helicopters and a canine unit, and I sat in a room in Seward and answered questions from patient men who wrote everything down. And I did not tell them about the antlers or the tracks or the voices, because I had worked out very quickly what happens to a person who tells them that. They found nothing. Not Andrew Clark, not Rebecca Ramirez, not the structure on the north-facing slope, which I described to them 3 times, and which 14 people with GPS units walked past and did not see. Stephanie White gave up photography and moved to Arizona, and we exchange a message about twice a year. Kimberly Sanchez is officially still missing, and her sister in Sacramento sends me a card every Christmas, and I have never once been able to write back. I moved as far from mountains as a person can reasonably get. Here is the last thing, and it is the reason I still have that photograph on my wall, instead of in a drawer. Rebecca said it does not leave the valley. She believed that. She died believing it, and she spent her life on that belief, and I have to assume she knew more about it than I ever will. But last October, at about 2 in the morning, I woke up in my house, 1,100 miles from Alaska, and there was somebody standing on my back lawn, at the edge of where the light reaches. And it called my name, and it called it in Rebecca's voice. I did not answer. I did not go to the window. I did not say a single word out loud until the sun came up. That is the only advice I have. It is the same advice an old man gave me in a bar in Seward, Alaska, for free, 4 years ago, and I did not take it seriously, and everyone who was at that table with me is dead or gone or somewhere in Oregon staring at a wall. If something out there says your name from the tree line, and it sounds exactly like somebody you love, and it sounds tired, and it sounds like it needs you, count heads first. There is a recording on my phone that I have never played all the way to the end. It is 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. The first 3 minutes are nothing but rain on a tarp and Sean Henderson complaining about the price of a fishing license in Alaska. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, somebody outside the tent calls my name. That is the part I cannot get past, because I have listened to those 2 syllables maybe 200 times since we came back, and every time I am more certain of the same impossible thing. Whatever said my name was standing about 9 feet from where I slept, and it was doing an impression of a man who had already been missing for 2 days. Let me back up. We were 7 people who had known each other for a long time, and one of us had a boat guy. That was the whole plan. Edward Barnes was 70 years old that summer, and had been talking about Baranof Island for 2 decades, ever since a cannery job in his 20s that he described the way other men describe a first marriage. He wanted one more trip out past Sitka before his knees quit for good. He put the money down himself when the rest of us hesitated. That is the kind of man he was. He did not ask twice. So in late July we flew into Sitka, 7 of us plus more gear than any of us wanted to carry, and we spent one night in town listening to the harbor clank and the ravens argue on the roofline of the hardware store. Sitka is a strange place if you have never been. It is a town of about 8,000 people pressed between an ocean full of islands and a wall of mountains that comes down almost to the water, and there is no road out. None. You arrive by boat or by plane and you leave the same way. The Tonga starts where the last house ends, and then it just keeps going, a green that is closer to black, 300 inches of rain a year, moss hanging in sheets, spruce so old and so wide that a person could hide behind one and you would never know. Kathleen Wood was 59 and had been a nurse for 31 years, and she was the one who insisted on the medical kit and the satellite messenger and the plan of what to do if somebody broke an ankle. Danielle Ross was 47 and had done more real backcountry miles than the rest of us combined. Kenneth Jenkins was 61 and brought 2 rifles, one for him and one for whoever wanted it. And he told us very seriously that the brown bears on that island are the highest density population anywhere on Earth, and that we would be sharing the salmon streams with them whether we liked it or not. Diane Coleman was 56 and could not sleep in a tent without a book. Monica Perry was 38, the youngest, quiet in a way that made people underestimate her. Sean Henderson was 44 and never stopped talking, which mattered later, because when Sean went quiet, you knew something was wrong. I organized the food, the routes, and the pickup. That was my job. I have organized a lot of trips. I want you to understand that I am not a careless person, and I have gone over that summer step by step maybe 1,000 times looking for the moment I made the mistake, and I still cannot find it. The boat took us north and east out of Sitka Sound on a flat gray morning with the ceiling down low. The man running it was named Wes, and he had a face like a piece of driftwood. He took us about 17 miles out toward a bay off the eastern shore, into water so still it looked solid, and he said very little the whole way. Sea lions came up alongside us and rolled over to look. Bald eagles sat on the tide rocks in numbers that would seem ridiculous anywhere else in the country. When we started unloading the dry bags onto the beach gravel, Wes asked me where exactly we intended to camp. I told him. Up the drainage, past the muskeg flats, near the old trapper cabin marked on the survey map. 6 days. Then he would collect us from the same beach. He was quiet for a moment. He looked past me at the tree line, and I remember he did not look at it the way you look at scenery. He looked at it the way you check a room. He said, "Keep your fires up at night, and keep everybody together, and if anything calls you out of camp after the light goes, do not answer it." Kenneth laughed and said something about bears. Wes did not laugh. He said, "Bears do not call." Then he pushed off, and the sound of the engine got smaller and smaller until the bay swallowed it, and there were 7 of us standing on a gravel beach at the bottom of the world with a wall of trees at our backs. Diane said, "Well, that was cheerful." Edward, who had been grinning since the plane landed, said that every boat operator in Alaska tells that story to every tourist he ever meets, and that in his cannery days they used to tell it worse, and that it was practically a service industry. He shouldered his pack. He was 70, and he shouldered it first. The hike in was 4 hours of the hardest easy miles you will ever walk. There is no trail. There is a creek bed, and there is devil's club growing shoulder high with thorns on the underside of every leaf. And there is blowdown you go over or under or around. And there is muskeg, which is a bog wearing a costume, where the ground looks like a meadow, and then your leg goes in to the knee. Everything drips. Everything smells like cedar and rot and salmon. Sound behaves strangely in that forest because moss absorbs it. You can shout, and it goes about 40 feet and dies. We reached the flats above the drainage around 6 in the evening and found the cabin exactly where the map said, which surprised me, because those old structures usually fall in and disappear. It was small, 12 by 14, cedar shakes gone green, a stovepipe, 1 window with no glass. The door was closed but not latched. Danielle got there first and pushed it open with her boot, and then stood very still. Inside, on the plank floor, somebody had stacked the bones of a deer into a neat cone about knee-high, not thrown, not scattered by an animal. Stacked, tallest in the center, the way a child builds with sticks, and every long bone in the pile had been snapped clean in half. We did not sleep in the cabin. I want that on the record, because people ask. Kenneth wanted to. He said 4 walls and a door beat nylon when there are bears around, and he was not wrong about the bears. But Kathleen took one look at that pile of bones and said, in the flat voice she probably used for 31 years, telling families bad news, that whatever made that had hands, and she was not sleeping in its house. So we set the tents in a rough circle on the flat about 80 yards off, near the creek, and we built the fire ring bigger than we needed, and Sean made jokes the entire time, in the specific tone people use when they are trying to talk themselves out of a feeling. The first night was fine. That is what I keep coming back to. The first night was completely, boringly fine. We ate, we drank a little. Edward told the cannery stories we had all heard. Monica photographed the light coming through the spruce at 10 at night, because in southeast Alaska in July, the sun does not really commit to setting. It just leans. There is a long blue hour where the world goes the color of old glass, and you can still read a map at 11 at night. Diane read her book. Danielle laid out the next day's route. At some point I remember thinking that Wes had done us a favor, because the little bit of fear he put in us had made everybody careful, and careful is how you come back from a place like that. The second day we walked up the drainage toward the ridge, and that was when we found the first thing that did not fit. It was a game trail, cut through salmonberry, well used, the kind of tunnel a bear makes going down to fish. About a mile up it, Danielle stopped and crouched and put her hand next to a print in the mud without touching it. Kenneth came up and looked and said, "That is a bear." Danielle said no. And it was not. I have seen bear tracks. A brown bear track is wide and blunt with claw marks well forward of the toes. This was long, narrow at the heel and spread at the front, 5 toes, and the toes were too long, and there was no claw mark at all. If you had shown me a photograph and told me it was a man walking barefoot through deep mud, I might have believed you, except for the size, and except for the fact that the depth was wrong. The mud around it was soft. A man of that stride length would have sunk to the ankle. This had barely pressed in. Kenneth said something about a hoax, some local kid, and Danielle stood up and pointed with 2 fingers, and we followed the line of them. They went about 30 yards up the trail and then they stopped. Not turned, not stepped off into the brush. Stopped, mid-stride, in open soft ground, with nothing overhead but sky and the tops of the spruce. Sean said the word that everybody was thinking and nobody wanted to be the first to say, and he said it as a joke, with his hands up, doing a voice. He said, "Skinwalker." Diane told him to shut up. She said it harder than she meant to. Later, back at the tents, Edward said the thing that made it worse. He said that when he worked out of Sitka in the 70s, the older men who had grown up on that coast would not talk about certain things at night, and that they did not have the word Sean used, because that word belongs to a different people 1,500 miles south and does not belong on Baranof Island at all. He said the local word was different and older, and that he had only ever heard it once, from a man who was drunk and who stopped talking the second he realized what he had said out loud. Edward said the man told him one rule. He said, "If you hear a person you love calling you from the trees, you check where that person is standing before you answer." We laughed at that. We actually did. If you are listening to this and you think you would not have laughed, I promise you that you would have. If you are still with me at this point, do me a favor and tap the like button before we go further, because the rest of this gets very hard for me to tell. That second night, the noises started. It began around 1 in the morning, in that gray-blue, not quite night. I heard something moving through the brush about 100 yards out, working a slow half-circle around the camp. Big, not sneaking. It was not trying to be quiet. It stepped, paused, deliberate, and when it moved, the birds did not scatter and the creek noise did not change, and I lay there in my bag doing the math on how big an animal has to be to make that much noise, and coming up with an answer that scared me. Then it made a sound. The best way I can describe it is a woman clearing her throat. 2 syllables, low, absolutely human, absolutely conversational, coming from a place where no human being should have been at 1 in the morning 17 miles from anywhere. I heard Kenneth unzip his tent. I heard the bolt on the rifle. I heard him say, "Hello?" And the forest said, "Hello." It said it in Kenneth's voice, not an echo. Echoes do not have a half-second delay and they do not change the emphasis. Kenneth said hello like a question. The trees said it like a greeting. Nobody slept after that. We built the fire up until it was too big and sat around it in a ring with our backs to the flames and our faces to the gloom, and Sean did not say one word for 3 hours, which is how I knew that this was real, and that all of us knew it was real, and that we had run out of ways to pretend. At about 4 in the morning, when the light came back properly, we found where it had walked. The half-circle was there in the moss, pressed in, 110 yards out from the fire ring, all the way around us, 200 and something steps. It had circled the camp 7 times. And Danielle, who counted, went pale and said the thing none of us wanted to hear. She said, "There are 7 of us." We decided to leave. That is the part people get wrong when they hear stories like this. They imagine a group of idiots insisting on staying. We were not idiots. We voted at 4:30 in the morning around a fire we had built too big, and it was unanimous. And Kathleen was already on the satellite messenger to Wes asking for an early pickup. The problem was that Wes could not come. The weather had turned outside, one of those Gulf of Alaska systems that closes the water for days, and the reply came back that he could not run that bay until the swell dropped, and his estimate was 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days. That was the whole thing. 2 days. We could have walked back to the beach and waited there, and I have thought about that choice more than any other. We did not, because the drainage was 4 hours of blowdown and muskeg in bad light with a 70-year-old man and a 56-year-old woman with a bad hip, and because Kenneth made the argument that any hunter would make, which is that you do not walk through thick brush toward the coast when something is following you. You pick ground you can see, and you hold it. So we picked the cabin. We cleared the bones out. Edward and Sean carried them out in a tarp and dumped them in the creek, and I remember Edward standing there afterward washing his hands over and over in that freezing water, longer than he needed to. The cabin had 1 window and 1 door. We hung a tarp over the window and we wedged the door with a split of cedar. We stacked wood inside. Kenneth took the first watch with the rifle and I took the second, and we set it up so somebody was awake every hour of that gray night with a view of the clearing. Nothing came. That is what I want people to understand about the third night. Nothing came, and it was worse, because we sat in that cabin for 9 hours listening to 7 people breathe into the rain start, and nothing came. And by morning half of us had convinced ourselves we had panicked over a bear and a trick of the acoustics in a forest that eats sound. Monica was the one who said we should not go outside separately for any reason. Kathleen agreed. We made a rule, and everybody agreed to the rule, and I have never in my life seen a rule broken so fast. At about 10 the next morning, in full daylight, in rain, Edward Barnes went out to the creek to fill the water bags. He told Sean he was going. Sean was asleep. Sean says now that he heard it and answered and went back under, and I believe him, because we were all running on about 6 hours of sleep across 3 nights. Edward did not come back. We found the water bags at the creek edge, filled, capped, sitting upright on a flat rock, which is the detail that has never left me. He filled them. He capped them. He set them down neatly. And then something happened that made him walk away from 4 gallons of water he had just carried down to get. There were no tracks. It had rained hard for 2 hours, and the creek bank was gravel, and there was nothing. We spread out in pairs, screaming his name, working outward from the creek in a widening circle, and the forest took our voices at 40 feet and gave nothing back. We searched until the light went. Kathleen was clinical about it. Grid lines, time limits, whistle signals, and she was very good, and it did not matter. Danielle found his hat about 400 yards upslope, in a place a 70-year-old man with 2 bad knees could not have climbed in the time available. It was hanging on a broken spruce branch at a height of about 11 feet. We went back to the cabin at last light because we had nothing else to do. Nobody ate. Kenneth sat with the rifle across his knees facing the door, and Sean sat facing the window, and Diane cried without making any sound at all, and Monica held on to her, and Kathleen kept saying we would go out at first light and find him. And I think she believed it, and I know that I did not. At 2:17 in the morning, Edward called us. His voice came from the tree line, about 60 yards out, and it was him. I need you to understand that. It was not close. It was not an approximation. It was Edward Barnes with his particular rasp and his particular way of leaning on the first word, and he said, "Hey, I am hurt. I am down here. I need help." Diane got to the door before anybody could stop her, and got the cedar wedge halfway out before Danielle and I dragged her back and put her on the floor. She screamed at us. She called us things I will not repeat. She said we were leaving him out there to die in the rain. And while she screamed, the voice kept talking, and that is when it went wrong, because it did not respond to her. A hurt man 60 yards from a lit cabin hears somebody screaming his name and he answers. This did not. It just kept saying the same 3 sentences in the same order with the same emphasis, over and over, like a bird that has learned a phrase. "Hey, I am hurt. I am down here. I need help." 9 times, I counted. The 10th time, halfway through, the voice slid, the way a radio slides off a station, and for about 2 words it was not Edward at all. It was something lower and wetter that had no business making words, and then it caught itself and went back to being Edward, and it finished the sentence. Then it stopped. Diane went quiet on the floor. She stopped fighting us. She put both hands over her mouth and she stayed like that until morning. By the 4th day, we were not 7 people anymore. We were 6 people and a piece of luggage none of us would put down. The rain had gone from hard to constant, which in that country means the creek comes up and the ground gives way and the sound of the forest becomes one long white hiss that hides everything. Kathleen got a message through. Wes replied that the swell was still bad but that he would try the following morning if it dropped, and he said one other thing, and I have the message saved. He wrote, "Do not let anyone leave alone, and do not go looking for anyone who is missing." Kenneth read it out loud and then said what all of us were thinking, which was that this man knew something, and that he had known it on the beach, and that he had put 7 people ashore anyway. I do not blame Wes anymore. I did for a long time. What would he have said? There are 90 trips a summer out of that harbor, and nothing happens on 89 of them. We agreed to move to the beach at first light in one group, packs light, food abandoned, 4 hours down the drainage, and to wait on open gravel where we could see in every direction. Kenneth had the rifle at the front, I had the second rifle at the back. Kathleen and Diane in the middle. It was a good plan. It was the correct plan. We never got to use it, because of what happened at 11 that night. It started with the smell. I had noticed it in patches over the previous 2 days and put it down to a salmon carcass somewhere upstream. But that night, it came into the cabin under the door, and it was so strong that Monica gagged. It is not a smell I can describe well. Wet fur and copper and something sweet under it, like fruit going over. It was the smell of an animal that had been dead for a week and was still walking around. Then something took hold of the cabin wall. Not knocked. Took hold. The whole wall on the creek side moved inward maybe 2 inches, the shakes flexing, the top plate groaning, and dust came down out of the roof beams in a sheet. 6 people were pressed against the opposite wall in under a second. Kenneth had the rifle up at the window and Sean was shouting and I could not hear my own voice. It went around the cabin, testing. That is the only word. It put its weight on each wall in turn, the way you would test a fence before you climbed it, and each time the whole structure leaned and settled. On the 4th wall, the one with the window, it stopped, and something moved the tarp aside. I saw a hand. It came in about 8 inches, palm up, fingers curling in a slow, beckoning motion, the way you call a child. The fingers were far too long. The skin was gray, white, and loose at the joints, and there was hair on the back of it. Not fur, hair, sparse and long, and the nails were split and packed with black, and it was wearing Edward's watch. Kenneth fired. In an enclosed space, without protection, the noise of a rifle is a physical injury. The window frame blew apart. The hand was gone before the splinters landed. And then something outside made a sound that I still hear at least once a week, a sound that started as a scream and turned into laughter and then, at the end, turned into Diane Coleman's voice saying, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." Diane was standing 3 feet from me when it said that. She looked at the window, she looked at all of us, and whatever was left of her broke, right there, in front of 6 people who loved her. She got the door open. I do not know how. Sean had the cedar wedge in his hands afterward and could not explain it either. She went out into the rain and she ran, not toward the beach, not toward anything, just out, and Sean went after her, because Sean was that kind of man, and Danielle grabbed my jacket with both hands to keep me from going after both of them. They did not scream. That is what nobody expects. There was no sound at all from the clearing, just the rain, and then about 40 seconds later, from somewhere up the slope, there was one short noise that could have been a person and could have been a tree coming down in the wind. Then, from 3 different directions at once, Diane's voice began calling for help. 3 directions, at the same time. The same words. Kathleen put her hands over Monica's ears like Monica was a child, and Kenneth sat down on the floor with the rifle in his lap and started to cry. 61 years old, a man who had hunted his whole life, and he said over and over that he had hit it dead center at 15 feet, and that it had not bled. We 4 sat in that cabin with a broken window and an open door until the light came. At first light we went out and found Sean about 120 yards up the slope. I am not going to describe what had been done to him. I will say only that whatever it was had taken time, and that some of what had been done was not the work of teeth, and that his mouth had been arranged. Diane we never found. Not that day, not later, not by the troopers, not by the dogs they flew in from Juneau, not ever. 4 of us started down the drainage that morning. Kathleen Wood, Kenneth Jenkins, Danielle Ross, Monica Perry, and me. 5. I said 4. I have written this account down twice, and both times I wrote 4, and I do not know what to do with that. The walkout took 9 hours instead of 4, because the creek had come up and we had to cross the flats high, through blowdown, in rain that came sideways. Nobody spoke unless it was necessary. Kenneth walked in front with the rifle, and I walked at the back with the other one, and I spent 9 hours looking behind me and seeing nothing at all. It did not follow us, or it did not follow us in a way that any of us could see. Twice I heard something big shift its weight in the brush parallel to our line, and once, around midday, Monica stopped and stared into a stand of hemlock for a long moment, and then kept walking and would not tell anyone what she had seen. We lost Kenneth about 2 miles from the beach. There was no drama in it. There was no voice. We came down a slope of wet deadfall single file in bad light, and he was 6 feet in front of Danielle, and Danielle looked down to place her boot on a log, and when she looked up, the trail was empty. 6 feet, 2 seconds, no sound. We spent 40 minutes on that slope shouting until Kathleen took my arm and said, in a voice with nothing left in it at all, that we were going to the beach now, and that if we did not go now, none of us would. We got to the gravel a little before 6 in the evening, 3 of us, and we sat in the open with our backs together and the rifle across my knees, and the tide came in, and the light did its long, slow blue lean, and at 11 minutes past 10, Wes came around the point with his running lights on. He did not ask what happened. He looked at 3 people where he had left 7, and he put a hand on Kathleen's shoulder, and he turned the boat around, and he did not say one word for 17 miles. The troopers were good about it. They were thorough. They flew in a team and searched for 9 days and found Sean, and found Edward's hat, and found nothing else, and the report says what those reports always say. Difficult terrain, high predator density, fatal bear encounter, probable. 4 persons missing, presumed deceased. They asked me about the recording. I played them the first 3 minutes. When it got to 3 minutes 40, I stopped it, and the trooper asked me to keep going, and I told him the truth, which is that I could not. Here is why. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, something outside the tent says my name. It is Edward's voice, and Edward had been gone for 2 days when that recording was made, and I have listened to that part maybe 200 times. But the recording is 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. There are 31 seconds after it, and about a year ago, in daylight, with the windows open, I finally let it run. At 3 minutes 52, a second voice answers from a different direction. It is my voice. It says, "I am coming." I was asleep. Kathleen has confirmed it. She was awake and she heard nothing at all, and she says the camp was silent that whole hour. So there is something out on that island, and it has my voice, and it knows my name, and for one night 4 summers ago it stood in the wet moss and had a conversation with itself using me. That is not the part that keeps me awake. Kathleen Wood and Monica Perry walked out of that drainage with me. We stayed close for a while afterward, the way people do. Then Kathleen moved to Oregon to be near her sister, and Monica and I still speak on the phone about once a month. Last November, Monica called me late. She had been going through the photographs from the trip, the ones she took in that long blue hour on the first evening, before any of it started. She had found one of the group at the fire, all 7 of us, taken on a timer from a rock. She asked me to count. I counted. 7 people around a fire. Then she told me to look at the tree line behind us, at the 3rd spruce from the left, at about 11 feet up. I am not going to tell you what is there. I have shown that photograph to 4 people, and 2 of them see nothing, and 2 of them go quiet and hand the phone back. But I will tell you this, and then I will stop. Monica ended the call that night by saying goodbye in a way she has never said it before, a long flat vowel on the 2nd syllable, and then she said my name. And it was not the way she says my name. It was the way it said my name, out there in the moss, at 3 minutes and 40 seconds, 4 summers ago. I have not called her back. The pilot refused to shut the engine off. That was the first thing. Not the tracks, not the silence, not the sound that came later. Just a man in a faded orange vest keeping the propeller turning on the water while we hauled 7 packs and 1 rifle case onto a gravel spit on the outer edge of Baranof Island, 3/4 of an hour south of Sitka by air, and would not look up at the ridge above us even once. Kathleen Wood asked him about the weather window. She was 59 years old and had planned this trip for 14 months, down to the ounce, down to the calorie. And she asked the question the way she asked everything, like a person who expected an answer she could write down. The pilot said the weather would hold 4 days. Then he said, and I remember the exact flatness of it, that if we heard anything up in the muskeg that sounded like a person, we should not answer it. Edward Barnes laughed. Edward was 70, the oldest of us by 9 years, and he had the kind of laugh that made other people relax whether they wanted to or not. He asked the pilot if that was a bear thing. The pilot said it was not a bear thing. Then he pulled the door shut, and the floats broke the water, and the plane lifted away over the inlet, and the sound of it faded until the only thing left was the tide moving stones against each other. 7 of us stood there, 8 counting me. I want to be honest about who we were, because later people asked, and the way they asked made it clear they thought we were fools. We were not fools. Kathleen had summited Verstovia 11 times. Kenneth Jenkins was 61 and had guided in the Tongass for 2 decades before his knees gave out, and he knew the drainages on that island better than he knew his own street. Sean Henderson was 44 and had the only rifle among us, a bolt action he cleaned every night the way some people say prayers. Diane Coleman was 56 and carried the satellite communicator. Danielle Ross was 47 and had a nurse certification and a medical kit the size of a small suitcase. Monica Perry was 38, the youngest, and she carried the camera and she filmed everything, which is the reason any part of this can be checked. And Edward, who had been coming north every August since before some of us were born, to hunt Sitka blacktail in the high country when the deer moved up out of the timber and stood in the alpine like they had forgotten what fear was. That was the trip. 4 days, 2 of hunting, 2 of walking, a summer holiday for people old enough to know that there are not an unlimited number of summers left. We started up from the beach a little after noon. The route Kenneth chose followed a creek bed through the salmonberry and then broke out of the timber onto open muskeg, that strange, spongy ground the Tongass grows where the water cannot drain, all sphagnum moss and stunted pine and little black ponds that look shallow and are not. It is beautiful country. I need you to understand that, because everything that follows is going to make it sound like a bad place. And it was not a bad place. It was one of the most beautiful places I have ever put my boots on. The moss was gold and rust and green. The air smelled like cedar and salt and rain that had not fallen yet. Behind us the inlet flashed silver every time the clouds moved. We climbed for 3 hours and we saw nothing alive. Kenneth was the one who said it out loud, around the 2nd hour, when we stopped to strip layers. He said the birds were wrong. Diane asked what he meant. Kenneth said there were no birds, no thrush, no jay, no raven. In the Tongass in August you cannot walk 200 yards without a raven finding you and telling the whole island about it. We had walked 3 miles and we had not heard one call. Edward said the weather was turning and the birds knew it before we did. Kenneth said nothing. He looked back down the slope the way we had come, and he looked for a long time, and then he shouldered his pack and started walking again, and he did not answer Diane when she asked if he was all right. We made camp on a bench of higher ground where the muskeg gave way to solid rock and a few wind-bent hemlocks, about 400 feet above a shallow bowl of ponds. Good sight lines in 3 directions. Kenneth chose it. He said he wanted to be able to see anything that came at us from the timber, and Sean asked, joking, "See what?" And Kenneth said bears, and the way he said the word made it clear he was choosing it the way you choose a coat that does not quite fit. We set 4 tents. We ate. Monica filmed the sun going down over the water, which took a long time, because in southeast Alaska in August the light does not so much fall as it lies down slowly, red and orange along the whole western rim, and it can be 9 at night and still bright enough to read. At some point in that long fading, while Kathleen was rinsing a pot and Danielle was repacking her kit, and Edward was telling a story about a boat he once owned, I looked down into the bowl of ponds below us. There was a deer standing in the water. That is not strange. Blacktail cross muskeg ponds all the time. What was strange was that it was standing in the middle of the largest pond, in water up to its chest, absolutely still, facing our camp. I watched it for what I would guess was 6 or 7 minutes. It did not lower its head. It did not shift its weight. It did not do any of the small, constant movements a living animal does. Its ears did not move. I called Kenneth over. He looked. He looked for a long time. Then he asked me, very quietly, so the others would not hear, how long it had been there. I told him. He said that deer do not stand in water. I said it was standing in water. He said, and I remember this word for word, that a deer will cross water, and a deer will drink water, and a deer will run into water to get away from something, but a deer does not stand in cold water in the evening for 6 minutes without moving, because a deer that does that dies. We went and got Sean and his binoculars. By the time we came back, the pond was empty, and the surface of it was perfectly smooth, without a ripple, without a wake, without any track in the moss on either bank, and the light was going, and Kathleen called us in for coffee, and I told myself I had misjudged the distance and the shape and the time. That was the first night. Nothing happened on the first night. I have thought about that a great deal since. I think it was listening. The second day was good. I want to say that clearly, because when people tell stories like this one, they compress the fear until it seems like it never stopped, and that is not how it happened. On the second day the sky opened, and the whole island came out of the cloud, and we walked a high ridge in warm wind with the Pacific on our left going out forever, and Edward found a patch of blueberries, and we all ate until our hands were stained, and Monica filmed Kathleen laughing at something Danielle said. And if you watch that footage now, you will see 8 people having one of the better days of their lives. We saw no deer. Kenneth did not comment on that. He had gone quiet in a way that was not like him, and he walked at the back all day, and twice I turned around and found him stopped, looking behind us at a slope with nothing on it. We came back to camp around 6. Nothing was taken. That is the part I still cannot get past. If a bear comes into your camp, things are eaten, containers are opened, the ground is a mess. Nothing had been eaten, nothing was missing, but the 4 tents had been moved. Not knocked over, not torn, moved, each one lifted, stakes and all, and set down again facing the opposite direction, so that every door now looked outward at the timber instead of inward at the fire ring. The stakes were still in the ground at correct depth. The guy lines were still tight. Kathleen had left a mug on a flat stone by her door, and the mug was still on the flat stone, but the stone had been carried with the tent. Whatever did it had lifted a fully pitched tent, stakes seated in the moss, and set it down again without spilling a mug. Sean said it was wind. He said it in the voice of a man who did not believe himself and wanted somebody to help him believe it. Diane got the satellite communicator out and checked it, and it was fine. Full charge, good signal, and she asked if we should call. Call who? Kathleen said. And say what? That somebody rotated our tents. Kenneth had not spoken. He was walking a slow circle around the camp perimeter, 20 yards out, head down, reading the moss. When he came back, his face had gone a color I did not like. He asked Monica to bring the camera. Then he took us out to a wet patch of ground about 30 yards downslope, a place where the moss gave way to bare gray mud around a seep. There were tracks in it. The first set was a black-tailed deer, walking, 4 hooves, perfectly ordinary, coming out of the timber and heading toward camp. 6 yards along, the deer tracks stopped. They did not fade. They did not get shallow. They stopped, mid-stride, in soft mud that held everything, and where they stopped there began another set of prints, going on in the same direction, in the same line, at the same spacing, without a gap and without a stumble. They were the prints of a bare human foot. They were too long. Not wide, not a giant, just long, longer than any of us, and the toes were wrong in a way that took me a moment to place. They were too long as well, and they had gripped, dug into the mud at the tips the way fingers would. Sean laughed. It was a terrible sound. He said somebody was messing with us. He said there were people on this island, hunters, kids from town with a boat, and somebody had carved a stamp out of wood, because that was a thing people did. That was a real thing that had actually happened in other places. Kenneth said there were 9 of those prints, that they were sunk to different depths depending on the ground, that the mud was pressed up between the toes, and that if Sean wanted to believe a person had walked out here with a wooden stamp on a stick to fool 8 strangers, he would not argue with him. Then Edward said the word. He was standing a little apart, and he had his hat in his hands, and he was 70 years old, and I had never once seen him afraid of anything. He said he had seen this before. Not here. 1978. On a job in the Southwest, near a place he did not name, and an old man he worked with had shown him a set of prints exactly like these, and had told him what made them, and had told him the name, and had told him never to say the name out loud in a place where it might be listening. Danielle asked him what the name was. Edward said he would not say it. He said the only rule the old man had given him was that you do not name it, you do not follow it, and you do not answer it when it calls you. Diane asked, and I could hear her trying to keep her voice level. When it calls you what? Edward put his hat back on. He said, when it calls you by your name. We ate early. Nobody had much. Kenneth built the fire up bigger than he had the first night and said nothing about why. Sean loaded the rifle and left it loaded, leaning against a rock where he could reach it, and Danielle asked him not to, and he told her, politely, no. The light went out of the sky around 10. At 11:15, Diane's voice came out of the timber. I need to describe this properly. We were all inside our tents, but nobody was asleep, and the tents were still turned outward because we had not wanted to touch them. Diane was in the tent next to mine. I could hear her breathing. I could hear the small plastic sound of her turning the communicator over in her hands. And from the tree line, about 60 yards below the camp, Diane's voice said, help me. It was her voice, not a voice like hers. Hers. The particular low rasp she gets in the evening, the way she flattens the vowel in the middle of the word, and it said it wrong. It said the words in the right order with the right sounds, and no feeling underneath them at all, like a person reading a sentence in a language they do not speak, perfectly pronounced, completely empty. Diane made a noise in her tent that I will hear until the day I die. Kathleen said, out loud, calmly, from her tent, "Nobody move and nobody answer." The voice said it again, "Help me." Same intonation exactly. A recording would vary more than that. It was not a recording, because it moved. The second time it came from 40 yards to the left of where the first had come, and there had been no sound of anything crossing the muskeg between the two. Then it said Diane's name. Then it said it in Kenneth's voice. Then it said it in mine. I lay in that tent and I listened to my own voice, my own exact voice, calling a woman's name from out in the lightless muskeg. And I understood with a completeness I have never felt about anything else that whatever was making that sound was not a person, had never been a person, and had been standing close enough to us, for long enough, to learn all of it. It went on for about 40 minutes. Then it stopped. At some point after that I heard Edward praying in the tent across the fire ring, very quietly, in a language I did not know he had. Kenneth was gone in the morning. His tent was zipped from the outside. That is not something a person can do. His boots were in the vestibule, both of them, laced. His pack was there, his water was there, his jacket was there, and it was raining lightly, and it had been raining since about 4. Sean and I searched the perimeter first, then all 7 of us searched, in pairs, spiraling outward, calling, for 2 hours. And I remember Kathleen making us count off every 10 minutes. And I remember how much I came to need that count, the sound of 7 voices proving they still existed. Diane sent the message at 8:40. She used the satellite communicator and she typed it herself and she read it out to us before she sent it so that we all agreed it was true. 1 member of party missing overnight. No injuries known. Request search assistance. She attached the coordinates. The device confirmed delivery. Nobody came that day. There was weather on the coast. We found that out later. At the time, we simply sat in a camp on a rock bench in the rain and waited for a helicopter that never got off the ground in Sitka. At around 11, Monica found the rifle. Sean had left it in his tent. It was now standing upright in the muskeg, 110 yards downslope, driven muzzle first into the moss so that about half its length was buried, standing straight as a fence post. The bolt was open. The magazine was empty. We never found the rounds. Sean sat down on the wet ground when he saw it. He was a man who I had never seen sit down on wet ground in his life. At around 2 in the afternoon, we heard Kenneth. He was calling from up the ridge, above the camp, in the fog. He was saying that he was hurt, that he had fallen in the night, that his leg was bad, and he was asking us to come up. Danielle started walking toward it before anyone touched her. Edward got in front of her. He is 70 years old, and he weighs 150 pounds, and he put both hands on her shoulders and he told her no. He told her that Kenneth had gone out of a tent that was zipped from the outside. He told her that no man walks up a ridge at night with a bad leg and does not shout until dawn. He told her that thing had our voices, all of them, and that if she walked into that fog she would not walk out. Danielle was a nurse for 22 years. Every instinct she had was built around going toward the person who was calling. I watched what it cost her to stand still. I do not think I have ever seen anything braver, and I do not say that lightly, because of what happened to her. Kenneth's voice called for 6 hours. It never got hoarse. It never got weaker. A man calling for help for 6 hours in the rain loses his voice in the first 90 minutes. This did not. It called at exactly the same volume, with exactly the same words, in a loop, and every 20 minutes or so it would move, and the moving was the worst part, because you would hear it at the top of the ridge, and then, with no travel sound in between, 30 seconds later you would hear it 300 yards along the bench. And the muskeg between those 2 places is open ground that you cannot cross without sound and without being seen. Around 6, the fog thinned for perhaps a minute. Monica had the camera up. She has never let anyone else watch what is on it, and I have never asked her to. But she described it to the troopers, and she described it to me once, at a table in a bar in Juneau 11 months later, when we were both drunk enough to talk about it. She said she saw a shape on the ridge above us where the voice was coming from. She said at first she thought it was a deer, because of the antlers, and because of the way the neck came out of the shoulders. She said then it stepped forward, and she saw that it was standing on 2 legs, and that the legs bent the wrong way at the joint, and then corrected, as though it had remembered partway through the step how a person is supposed to be shaped. She said the head turned toward the camera before the fog closed. She said that the face was not finished. Those were her words. Not that it was ugly, Not that it was monstrous, that it was not finished, like something that had studied a face very carefully and had gotten almost all of it and had not understood which parts were supposed to move. We did not sleep that night. We sat in one tent, all 6 of us, shoulder to shoulder, and Sean sat by the door with a bear spray canister in each hand. And outside in the gloom, something walked a slow circle around us at a distance of about 40 feet, all night, and every few minutes it would stop and take a breath and speak in Kenneth's voice. And the terrible thing, the thing that broke something in me permanently, was that it started saying our names in the order we were sitting in. It knew where we were. In the tent. Left to right, Edward said near dawn, that it was counting us. The helicopter came at 9:40 in the morning. It flew a grid for 40 minutes, half a mile east of us, in cloud, and it did not see our smoke because we had no smoke, because everything was soaked, and then it turned and went home. Diane watched it go with the communicator in her hand, and the message sent and confirmed, and no one coming. Kathleen made the decision then, and I believe it saved 4 lives. She said we were walking out, not to the drop point on the beach where the plane had left us, which was 3 hours away through the timber, all of it lightless and close and blind. Instead, we would go north along open ground to a cove where Kenneth had said there was an old logging float and a shelter, and where a boat could come in. 6 miles, open muskeg most of the way. Nothing could get close to us in the open without being seen. We left everything except water, the kit, and the communicator. We walked from 10 in the morning until 7 at night, and for the first 4 hours nothing happened, and I felt something in my chest start to loosen, and I remember thinking, with the stupid hope of an animal, that we had gotten far enough away from wherever it lived. At around 2 in the afternoon we came over a small rise and found Kenneth's jacket. It was folded. That is the detail. It was folded into a neat square, the way a shop folds a garment, and set on a flat rock in the middle of open ground where we could not possibly miss it, at the exact center of the only route north. There was nothing else. No blood, no drag, no tracks. Diane started to cry and could not stop for about a mile. At around 5, the weather came in properly. The wind went to the southeast and the rain went sideways and the visibility dropped to maybe 80 yards, and the open ground that had been protecting us all day became something else entirely, because now the open ground was a gray room with no walls that we could not see across. Danielle went at 6:10. She was second from the back. I was third. Monica was last. There was a stretch where we had to go single file between 2 ponds along a spine of firmer moss maybe 4 feet wide, and Danielle stepped onto it ahead of me, and I looked down at my own feet for the length of 2 steps, because the moss was slick. And when I looked up, the line ahead of me ended. There was no sound. I want to be precise. There was wind and rain, and there was no other sound. No cry, no splash, nothing. Her medical kit was on the moss in front of me, upright, both straps unbuckled. I screamed. Sean and Kathleen came back down the line, and we spent 20 minutes in that place, in the water, in the rain, going into those ponds up to our chests with our arms out in front of us, feeling for her. And I found nothing but cold and roots, and Kathleen finally took my collar in her fist and put her face against mine, and told me that if we stayed there we would all be lying in that pond. And she was right, and I have hated her for being right for a long time, and she knows it, and she has forgiven me. We walked. The 5 of us walked. At around 7:30, in the last of the light, Danielle's voice started calling from behind us. It called for an hour. Then it changed. It stopped being help me and it started being a conversation. It started saying the private things. It said something to Sean that only his wife knew. It said something to Diane about her son. I do not know what it said, and Diane has never told me, and after that hour Diane did not speak again for 2 days. That is when I understood the shape of the thing. It was not hunting us for meat. If it had wanted meat, it could have had all of us on the first night, in our tents, one at a time. It was doing something else. It was taking us apart. It wanted the group to come apart into individual frightened people, because a frightened person alone stops and turns around and walks back toward a voice. Edward said the same thing, roughly, when we stopped to breathe. He said, "It is trying to make you answer. That is all it wants. Do not answer it. Not once. Not even to tell it to stop." Sean answered it at 9:15. He did not do it out of weakness. I need that written down somewhere. Sean Henderson turned around and shouted into the rain, because the thing had started using his daughter's voice, and his daughter was 11 years old and 2,000 miles away in Oregon. and he shouted her name once, just once. The calling stopped, the whole muskeg went silent, and the rain kept falling, and for maybe 15 seconds there was nothing at all in the world but the 5 of us breathing. Then something came through the water of the pond on our right at a speed I have never seen a living thing move, and it did not go around us, and it did not touch 4 of us, and Sean was not there anymore. We ran. 4 of us ran in a black world with 2 working headlamps, and we did not stop for a very long time. We reached the cove a little after 1 in the morning. The old float was still there, rotted, half sunk, and there was a shelter, if you can call it that, 3 walls of plank and a tin roof that a logging crew had left behind decades before. It smelled of creosote and mildew. It had no door. Diane sent the message. This one she did not read aloud. She typed for a long time with her hands shaking so badly that Kathleen had to hold the device steady. Then we sat in that shelter with our backs against the wall, and we waited for the sun, which in August in that country comes at about 4:30, and the 3 hours between 1 and 4:30 are the reason I have not slept a full night since. It came to the edge of the shelter at around 2. I did not see it. I have that at least. I heard it stop just outside the open wall, close enough that I could hear the water coming off it and hitting the ground. And it started to speak. It went through them. All of them. Kenneth first, then Danielle, then Sean. And it was not calling for help anymore, because there was no one left to walk out to it. It was just talking. It said ordinary things. It said the things they had said on the good day, on the ridge, in the sun, with the blueberries and the wind. It said Danielle's joke that had made Kathleen laugh. It said it perfectly, and it said it to the wall of a shelter at 2 in the morning to 4 people who could not stop hearing it. Monica put her hands over her ears and Kathleen pulled them down and held them, because Kathleen understood something the rest of us did not, which was that we needed to be able to hear it coming. At around 3 it used Edward's voice. Edward was sitting 9 inches away from me at the time. I felt him go still. It said, in his voice, that he was old, and that he had known this was coming for 40 years. Edward stood up. Kathleen said his name. He told her, in his own voice, which was not the same as the one outside, that he had made a mistake in 1978, that he had followed a set of tracks once when he had been told not to, and that it had been waiting to finish that conversation ever since, and that it was not going to leave while he was in this room with us. He said he was 70 years old, and that he had a bad heart and about 2 winters left in him, and that this was the best possible use of the material. Then he walked out of the shelter, and he did not run, and he told it, out loud, using the name he had refused to say for 3 days, that he was here, and that it could come and take him. We heard him walking away over the stones for maybe 40 seconds. Then nothing at all, no sound of any kind. Nothing came back to the shelter that night. The boat found us at 6:20 in the morning. 2 men from Sitka, in a 32-foot aluminum skiff, who had been listening to the traffic on the emergency channel, and who had come out through weather that had kept the helicopters on the ground. They pulled 4 soaked people off a rotten float, and one of them gave Monica his own jacket, and neither of them asked us a single question for the whole ride back, and I have never in my life been so grateful for silence. The search ran for 19 days. Ground teams, air, dogs, divers in the ponds. It was one of the largest searches in the history of that district. They found Kenneth Jenkins's jacket, folded, on a rock. They found Danielle Ross's medical kit. They found Sean Henderson's rifle standing upright in the muskeg. They did not find one bone. They did not find one boot. They did not find one thread of clothing on a branch. And if you know anything about the way people are found in that country, you know how impossible that is. 4 adults do not go into 6 square miles of open muskeg and leave nothing. The report used the word inconclusive 11 times. I counted. Kathleen Wood does not hike anymore. She sold every piece of gear she owned in one afternoon and gave the money to the volunteer search organization in Sitka, and she has not been north of Seattle since. Diane Coleman moved to Arizona, which I understand, because in Arizona you can see for 40 miles in every direction. Monica Perry still has the footage. She has never uploaded it. She told me once she is not afraid of people not believing her. She is afraid of people believing her and going up there to look. And me. I moved twice. I sleep with a light on, which is a small humiliation I have made my peace with. Here is the part I have not told the troopers, or my family, or anyone except the 4 people who were in that shelter, because they are the only ones who will not tell me I imagined it. 9 months after we came back, in the spring, in a town 2,000 miles from Baranof Island, My neighbor knocked on my door in the middle of the afternoon. She is a kind woman in her 70s. She wanted to know if everything was all right, because she had heard me the night before, out in the yard behind the fence, in the rain, at about 2 in the morning. She said I had been calling out. She said I had been calling her name over and over, asking her to come out and help me, and she had almost come. She had actually put her shoes on, and then something about the way I was saying it had made her stop with her hand on the door. She said it did not sound like a person who wanted help. She said it sounded like a person reading the words off a card. I was asleep in my bed all that night. There was no rain in my town that week. I have thought about what Edward said, near the end, about it wanting an answer. I have thought about the fact that it followed a man for 40 years across a continent for the crime of walking 100 yards down a set of tracks. And I think about the fact that I lay in a tent on the second night on that island and heard my own voice out in the muskeg, and I have thought about it every night since. And here is what I have decided. It did not learn my voice. It took it, and it has been walking around with it ever since. And it is using it to knock on doors and stand behind fences and call people out into places where nobody can see them. So this is what I want to leave you with, and then I am finished. If you ever hear me calling you from somewhere you cannot see, from a tree line, from a fog bank, from a yard at 2 in the morning, saying your name in a voice that sounds exactly like mine and carries nothing underneath it, I am asking you now, while I still have my own mouth to ask with, do not answer it. Do not answer it even once.